Hello, students. I hope y'all had a good spring break. But here it is. It's time for another apartheid lecture. So this is going along with what the last lecture was. Apartheid comes into being in 1949. As we mentioned earlier, well, let me just go through the ideology. Apartheid is a government policy that's been associated with Afrikaner nationalism. It is white supremacy. It's not nationalism. You can have nationalism without it being white supremacy. Um, Not all the Afrikaner nationalists were supporters of segregation. Some of them felt like they can be proud of who they are and enjoy themselves and appreciate the culture of the others who lived amongst them. The people who built apartheid didn't think so. White supremacy and racial segregation that it spawned actually began in English colonialist discourse. So they didn't just pull this out of the thin air. They were around people who were white supremacists and believed that whiteness made them better than others. Um, One of the hurdles that the Afrikaners had in building apartheid was bringing these two disparate white groups that had fought. And I really didn't go into this in the last lecture because, but I should have. I can't tell you why I didn't. I was just going along with what's in your book. But I'm teaching also Southern African history at the same time. And I was remembering, I mean, we're getting ready to talk about these Boer Wars, which start earlier in the 1800s when the British came and took over the Cape Colony. And they didn't end until towards the end of the 1800s. They started early 1800s and the end of the 1800s. Well, the British wanted dominance, and the Dutch, who had been there at this point for 200 plus years, was like, why? Why should we just give in to them? But they wanted the same things. The British wanted to be dominant, but they also wanted to deal with white people. The British knew that if they gave the Boers white supremacy in their apartheid, in turn, the Boers or the Afrikaners would give them peace and let them do what they wanted to do, to have the dominance that they wanted. And that's what happened. That's what happened. Afrikaners or the Boers, whichever word is the same group of people, they flourished more in education, they flourished more in the government, and the British were in charge of the economy. And that's what they wanted, and that's what they got when they brought the Union of South Africa together. Because what I should have mentioned in the last lecture, but I didn't, that you had these South African Boer republics, and they all came together with the Cape Colony Natal to create what we call the Union of South Africa. That's the nation of South Africa today. This is Vorster, who was a one of the prime ministers in South Africa. All right, so it starts in 39 when World War II gets going. Herzog and Smuts, who had built this coalition government, they fell apart because Smuts said, "I'm going to fight for the British." Herzog was like, "What? No. This is our time as Dutch people." They felt more of a kinship to the Germans, and they hated the British because the British came in and colonized them. The British didn't just colonize the Zulus and the other Osai and the other Africans who were there. They colonized the Afrikaners who were there. So Herzog left and joined Malan, Dr. Malan's party, but Malan wanted apartheid. So in '48, the National Party won the majority in Parliament. As a result, they created apartheid, and they created it over the next few years with laws. Everybody had an idea of what they wanted to be, but those laws came in and made it very clear and concrete. Uh, some similar things are going on in our country right now if you're paying attention. A lot of people are living in denial and they don't think it's happening, but it's happening right in front of our face. Um, so Hendrik Verwoerd consolidated the National Party as a force amongst Afrikaners and many Anglophone South Africans pushing whiteness. He said, "We're all together, whether you're British or you're Afrikaner, we're white. And we have these people who are not white, and they're beneath us, and they're less than us, so it's our jobs to keep them in their place. We need to run the government, and that's what they did. Voorwerk also was the one who shaped apartheid laws and other regulations, so he was the brains behind this operation. So they celebrated Jan van Riebeeck by all whites as a national symbol of white South Africans and derided by native South Africans. And look up Jan van Riebeeck. What's his first name, Jan? Look up Van Riebeeck. Y'all see, we talked about him in our Southern African history class. And I usually teach Southern African history in the fall and then teach apartheid in the spring, but I didn't do it that way this year. This is an example of the segregated trains. Slegs Blank, Europeans only. Slegs Blank, that is Afrikaner. That's the Afrikaner language, which is a dialect of Dutch. Europeans only, y'all understand English. So they created government. Voorwerk is the Native Affairs Minister from 1950 to 1958, and he was Prime Minister from 1958 to 1966. When they shot him, he was assassinated. See, in order to maintain a system like apartheid, kind of like segregation in the American South and segregation here in the U.S., you have to have violence. The whole system, the idea of putting people in a place of inferiority is a violent idea. And when you have a violent idea, you have to maintain that intellectual and cultural violence with actual physical violence. And this is what happened. So let's look at the laws, y'all. The laws, if you study American history, you look at Jim Crow laws, this is it. Population Registration Act of 1950 created four legal groups for all of the population. White, which is European, African, that's, African, full-blooded African, colored, which was the children of Europeans and Africans, biracial, we would call them in today's society, and Indian. Remember, the British had brought in a lot of Indian workers, so you had Indians there too. Okay, creating this and giving people passes, basically a passport to travel within the country. That's what they did. And your race was there. So there was areas that you shouldn't be, but they didn't get there yet. They were getting there. That's why that was the foundation, was to create these four legal groupings of people, and to keep those people separated. The Bantu Education Act of 1953 closed all the private schools that they had for natives and restricted higher education for natives. So what it did, they said, we're going to give these people a public education, but something that's useful for them, because they didn't want natives rising above a certain level. So most of the universities they created for the natives were to produce teachers for their schools. Teachers, they had preachers. And, they had a few other things, but the main thing was just teachers. All right, 1951, the Bantu Authorities Act is the one that created native homelands similar to the Indian reservations that we have in the U.S. It was modeled on our system. So to push all of these people on these Bantu homelands that were supposedly autonomous within South Africa, they called them Bantustans. And then they passed in 1958 the Promotion of Bantu Self-Government Act, which was pushing for these people to have their own governments within their own places, so they'll flourish if they're separate from white people. Well, here's the problem. That all seems nice and benevolent, but you got all the best land, Mr. White Man. You got all the best land, and you put these people who were there before you in these small areas where the land was poor and the population was dense. It was overpopulated. You have overpopulation, you're going to have disease. They set that up to keep whites and blacks apart, but mainly to profit. To profit. To profit. We mentioned Krotoa earlier, who they call the South African Pocahontas, because she married a Danish barber and had a lot of children, and her children intermarried into all of the top Afrikaner and families and French Huguenot families, which made up the Afrikaner people. But all of a sudden, they want everybody to be separate because they want to keep the land for themselves. And I must be clear, before they get here in the 1800s, the Afrikaners had worked with the British to disarm most of the African tribes around them. And the ones who weren't disarmed are the ones that kept their autonomy. And that's Lesotho. The Lesotho people were not disarmed. The British tried, but they defeated them. Eswatini, who made a separate deal with the whites to help them defeat other African tribes. And well, it's a lot more nuanced than that, but that's what I get from the readings. And the last one was Botswana. All throughout the years of apartheid, the British protected Lesotho, Botswana, and Eswatini. And the apartheid government tried their best to force those places to become a part of apartheid South Africa. Crazy, right? And this is a picture of Buthelezi, who was a Zulu chief when he was young. That's a picture when he was young, but he was a Zulu chief. All right, now let's talk about the petty apartheid laws. No interracial sex or marriage. And the question is, how can a law regulate sex? If y'all remember Trevor Noah, he wrote his autobiography called Born a Crime. Because his dad is white. When he was born, it was illegal for whites and blacks in South Africa to have sex. But his mom and daddy did it, and they made him. So they had that law. Separate facilities for travel, restroom, etc., similar to the American South. And I know I'm teaching in upstate New York, but I grew up in the shadow of Jim Crow. I know I look older. I ain't that old, y'all. I was born in 75. Jim Crow was ended in 65, so I was 10 years after that. But my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, and all the other older people around me, they talked about Jim Crow because it was a big part of their lives. My dad still talks about it. So when I read about this, I mean, I have that as a frame of reference of how racially divided societies work with laws. So they just basically separated everything. They had like in the South, they had the water fountains that said for whites only, this was for blacks only. Restrooms for whites only, the restroom for black only. Train cars for whites only, train cars for black only, etc. Schools for whites only, schools for black only. The nationalists wanted African chiefs to approve of their plan, and some of the African chiefs approved of their plan because they got a salary from the government. They're like, okay. Some of them didn't. And when you rose up against the apartheid South African government, they deposed you and they found their own person, their lackey, who would do their bidding. And the people who did support it did it grudgingly. And the young people didn't trust him anymore because they said, hey, you're letting these people mistreat us. Chief Buthelezi, who was a Zulu chief and later assassinated, he spoke out against the apartheid government, but he did it mildly. He gave them a little bit of the business, but not enough to get him deposed. But later on they kill him. So this is a little bit more of that apartheid, and I'll give y'all some more here shortly.